Hello and welcome. I'm Asuma Katauka and you are watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories. Today, U.S. President Donald Trump will host Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House, pushing a Gaza peace proposal amid European recognition of Palestinian statehood. This marks Netanyahu's fourth visit since Trump returned to office, as Israel seeks to shore up U.S. support while facing growing criticism. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has proposed building a joint aerial defense shield with its European partners to counter threats from Russia. Kyiv argues its experience with airborne threats would help NATO amid Russia's recent airspace incursions in Poland and the Baltic states, which Russia denies. Sweden is sending radars and anti-drone systems to Denmark to secure upcoming EU summits in Copenhagen after drone incursions disrupted air traffic at 6 airports, according to Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson. Denmark has now banned civilian drone flights and seen NATO and German forces boost airspace surveillance amid rising tensions. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has now ordered 200 Oregon National Guard troops under federal authority to Portland, following President Donald Trump's announcement to deploy troops to protect federal immigration facilities. Oregon Attorney General Dan Rayfield filed a lawsuit claiming the President Donald Trump exceeded his powers. Moldova's pro-EU ruling party scored a resounding victory over its Russian-leaning rival in a key parliamentary election. These reports are reported by their official results. The win is seen as a strong endorsement of Moldova's bid to join the European Union. At least 4 people were killed and 8 wounded in the shooting at the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Grand Blanc Township, Michigan, U.S., when gunmen rammed a vehicle into the building, opened fire, and set it alight. Officers then engaged and killed him, while investigators warned that more victims may still be found. Former Thai Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra has petitioned for a royal pardon for his 1-year jail sentence. After returning from 15 years of self-exile, the ex-Prime Minister was jailed after the Supreme Court ruled he had not served his original 8-year sentence. This follows the removal of his daughter, former Prime Minister Paetongtarn Shinawatra, just last month. Nepal has imposed travel bans on former Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli and 4 former senior officials. The youth-led protests over a social media ban, economic hardship, and corruption has left at least 73 people dead, burned parliament, government offices, and forced the government's collapse. The Israeli Defense Forces have showered Gaza City with leaflets warning citizens of Gaza to evacuate southwards, since the IDF is surrounding the city and will not stop its campaign till Hamas are defeated. The leaflets spelling out this warning in Arabic have been dropped all over Gaza, even as citizens remain adamantly against leaving their homes on the orders of the Israeli Defense Forces. Let's listen in.
الله علينا مناشير بقول لك انه يعني زي ما تقول المنطقه في خطر ومحاصرين البلاد ولازم انتهي حماس هيك هم بيحكوا المنشور والله اعلم ايش يصير يا بني انت تريد وانا اريد والله يفعل ما يريد هي اللي بصير في غزه يعني واحنا غزه الشعب غزه بعاني مش من اليوم بعاني منذ 50 سنه مش من اليوم.
And everyone here just running out and there is nowhere to run, you know. Civilians, all of them, and the Russians just take photos and records here. And after they're leaving about the dome this day, the mass destruction was really unbelievable, and everyone just evacuating Gaza, enforcing. And that's it.
British Foreign Secretary Vivienne Cooper has also spoken about the situation in the Middle East at the UK Labour Party's National Conference in Liverpool. Let's listen in.
Hamas must end its abhorrent detention of hostages, the calculated cruelty that has split and traumatized families for nearly 2 years. And the Israeli government must end the moral obscenity of this campaign that has seen food, water and medicine denied and an unconscionable loss of human life, because Palestinian civilians should not have to go another day in fear and hunger.
Now we move on. The Kremlin has accused Moldovan authorities of denying hundreds of thousands of Moldovans living in Russia the chance to vote in Sunday's parliamentary election. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov has said that only 2 polling stations were made available in Russia, affecting citizens who typically support pro-Russian forces. Moldova's pro-European Union ruling party won a clear victory over its Russian-leaning rival, boosting moves towards EU integration. Peskov further added that some political forces in Moldova have alleged violations, but said Moscow would let Moldovans sort out the issue internally. Around 500,000 Moldovan citizens live in Russia, yet only about 4,000 votes were cast there, mostly for the main pro-Russian blocs. By comparison, more than 38,000 votes were cast in Germany across 36 polling stations, largely supporting the ruling party. Moldovans celebrate their ruling pro-EU party's parliamentary victory despite accusations of Russian interference. The slim win is seen as an extraordinarily difficult struggle for a country divided between pro-EU and pro-Russia forces, including a breakaway region. Let's listen into what a few residents of Moldova have said.
După o lungă campanie, care a durat și în România, respectiv și aici, foarte complicată, cred ca niciodată. Deci, în sfârșit, putem respira liber și cred că cu ajutorul actualei guvernări, Republica Moldova să fie Uniunea Europeană, cu drepturi depline.
Dar și la noi nu se respectă regulile din Uniunea Europeană. Unde acolo așa prostii se fac? Nimeni nu permite așa să facă, dar la noi s-a permis. Și așa și Europa a trecut, ștașe. Și zici că amestecă. Dar asta...
Now we move on to our next news. According to North Korean state-run media, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has met with North Korean Foreign Minister Cho Son-hui yesterday in Beijing. This marks Choi's first visit to China in her capacity as North Korean Foreign Minister and the second meeting between the two within a month. Wang Yi, Foreign Minister of China, highlighted that the historic meeting between the leaders of the two countries earlier this month laid out a blueprint for bilateral relations. He also emphasized that the traditional friendship between China and North Korea is a precious asset shared by both nations, and reaffirmed that maintaining, consolidating, and developing these ties remains China's unwavering strategic policy. Choi further stated that as North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has emphasized, the friendly sentiments between the two countries will remain unchanged, regardless of shifts in the international situation. She also stressed the importance of strengthening cooperation to counter unilateralism and hegemony, as well as in establishing a multipolar world order based on justice and fairness. Now we move on. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius has called on the European Union to provide a more flexible regulatory framework for the defense industry. Speaking at the Warsaw Security Forum on Monday today, Pistorius urged Europe to give sustained and stronger support to Ukraine following intensive Russian bombardment over the weekend. He further stressed that European and Ukrainian defense industries must work more closely and effectively with the EU backing this collaboration through flexible regulations. Let's listen into what German Defense Minister has said.
We all have to provide sustainable support to Ukraine, more resiliently and more forcefully than in recent months. The European Union must back this by providing a much more flexible regulatory framework for the defense industry in Europe. This is the only way to quickly scale up our production capacities and, as a consequence, our deliveries to Ukraine. This is in our very own strategic interest, as our American allies are turning more and more towards other regions and as we work towards preserving peace and collective security in Europe. Vladimir Putin does not want a ceasefire, and he does not want peace for Ukraine. So today we must focus on empowering Ukraine and bolstering its defense. The strongest security guarantee for the moment will be world-class equipment, sufficient resources, and extensive training for the Ukraine armed forces. Ladies and gentlemen, Germany continues to stand firmly by the people of Ukraine. Our goal is to see Ukraine enter into meaningful negotiations to achieve lasting peace.
Now we move on. As the UN General Assembly is going to see its last session today, the agenda includes expected addresses from the leaders of Canada, Denmark, and Moldova as global delegates return for one of the final days of this year's UN General Assembly. This marks the conclusion of what has been the busiest week on the diplomatic calendar, dominated by urgent discussions on the wars in Gaza as well as Ukraine and Russia. Now, a UN Security Council meeting is also scheduled today, focusing on the escalating Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This comes after earlier this week, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed the General Assembly, declaring there is no foreseeable end to the war in Gaza. He also rejected a UN Commission's findings that accused Israel of committing a genocide, criticizing the report's conclusions on the displacement of civilians. To help us understand these developments and more, we spoke to Thomas Porteous earlier today, who is currently in New York City. Thomas, thank you for joining us from New York. Now, how did the rivalry between the US and China play out at UNGA 80th anniversary, and what does it mean for global power politics now?
Well, yes, of course, we are wrapping up this week here in New York. We close here in Times Square where we talk about all the developments that have happened this week. Of course, the two world's largest economies were at it again, mainly indirectly, though. We can, of course, reflect on that TikTok deal that occurred just 2 days ago. However, the tensions still remain. At the UNGA 80, China and the US clashed over multiple issues, including the war in Ukraine, of course, trade and influence in emerging regions. China called, of course, for multilateralism, whereas the US came forward with Donald Trump's protectionist speech, highly criticizing the institution and highly selling himself and giving himself credit for stopping 7 wars. China, of course, emphasized its narrative of neutrality. This, of course, came after Donald Trump accused China and, of course, India of funding Vladimir Putin's war inside Ukraine by buying their oil. Of course, the broader implication of the rivalry is growing and is more transactional and multipolar. Of course, that US and China trade war and war of words, of course, is not expected to go away very soon, but we will, of course, bring you every single bit of it.
Now, what's the latest on the Russia-Ukraine conflict after the strong statements we heard from both sides at UNGA 80?
Well, of course, as that conflict rages on, we even saw today Russia pounding Ukraine in multiple regions. However, at the UNGA, it was more words of peace. Of course, the diplomacy can continue there at the UNGA. However, on the ground, the war still very much continues and continues in a huge way. Kiev reiterated its stance and warned Western governments of the threat from Moscow. Of course, has asked for more pressure on Moscow, more sanctions and more military aid. Of course, Moscow's huge statement coming out of that conference was that Moscow does not show a threat to NATO or to Europe. This, of course, contradicts itself when drones fly into NATO and European airspace on multiple occasions. And so there has been huge updates in regards to that. The UNGA also reflected deep global divisions when it came to this conflict. Of course, Russia had very, very nice words to say about its global southern partners, including India, of course, fought for that seat on the Security Council here in New York. But of course, its war remains hugely controversial, particularly among those that Sergei Lavrov called the Golden Billion, the people who, according to him, control the quote-unquote global order. There is, of course, huge arguments for reform there. No practical outcome has, of course, come out of this, out of the UNGA, which is, of course, another reason why people are stressing that it does need reformers, is that it's not a peacekeeping body anymore. The war remains central to global strategy. Other states, votes and supply chains, sanctions, and military aid will continue shaping its trajectory. And so those decisions made by those men in suits will continue to decide what happens on the ground and which civilians suffer.
And Thomas, how did the Gaza war and the wider Middle East tensions have shaped discussions at UNGA, and what happens next?
Well, yes, huge developments out of the Middle East this week, whether that's out and in New York. Of course, we saw the fourth day open with Benjamin Netanyahu's speech, mass walkouts of his opening address, and then followed by huge protests here in New York City. However, outside of New York, we are expected to see a Benjamin Netanyahu-Trump meeting today. Trump has said he is optimistic on this deal between we don't know, essentially. He says he is optimistic on a ceasefire to bring peace to the region. He's been very, very positive in his words. That very much contradicts what Benjamin Netanyahu was saying in front of that podium, in front of an empty crowd on Thursday, where he delivered that speech. Of course, he made it sound like this war, of course, is very much not over, and so we will, of course, see updates in regard to that. We have to expect increased pressure on mediators to intervene, and diplomatic efforts will, of course, target de-escalation, humanitarian corridors, and possibly third-party guarantees. So what we can do is wait and hope to see some sort of movement when it comes out of that Oval Office meeting on a Monday between the Israeli Prime Minister and the American President.
Indeed. And Thomas, what do you make of the tone and tenor of the Global South? Is it changing its balance with Western powers?
Well, yes, of course. As I said, there was, of course, more demand for more global South nations to reform of multilateral institutions, for fairer development finance and equitable climate solutions. Of course, developing nations most hit by climate change, the likes of China, India, and others in Southeast Asia are frequently hit with climate disasters. These are the countries which, of course, feel the brunt of it much, despite Donald Trump's statements that on Tuesday that the whole thing is a con job, as he says. But the balance, of course, is subtle, with the rhetoric is stronger on structural constraints. They limit how far the Global South can indeed push here. That is why there is such a big call for reform, and what we'll do is we'll see how this will move forward. And the bottom line is the Global South is, of course, more assertive in its words, but when it comes to practicality, the structure, which is now 80 years old, of the United Nations, means in practice it's hard to put those words into action.
And what did the speeches and meetings at UNGA 80 tell us about how alliances like BRICS, NATO, and others are shifting?
Well, what the United Nations has shown us is that the world has become more divisive. BRICS, NATO, and other alliances are, of course, shifting. The BRICS group and other alternative blocs have held their own meetings, small bilateral meetings on the side. Of course, you can cite India as an example, who've, of course, held that BRICS meeting along with G20, met with South Africa and other nations like that as well, and of course met with the Americans early on in the week with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, despite the underlying tensions of trade and HB1 visa fees. Of course, some countries are hedging to seeking to belong to both Western and emerging blocs. Of course, India can be seen as one of them. Many people say this is a huge benefit. Many people say that it is unclear which alliance they belong to. They're becoming more fluid issue rather than fixed in these circumstances. The war in Europe, of course, and the competition in the Indo-Pacific demands institutional reforms, experts and more multiplex alliances, overlapping security, shifting coalitions for security, trade and technology and climate. So essentially, this UNGA has once again reiterated how divided the world is when it comes to working together. Moving forward, the world still remains divided, very sadly, and although voices are crying and crying for countries to work together, we can see in certain instances like the war in Ukraine being major driving factors between nations, there is not much hope in sight of course, that reform due to it being such a hard structural change. But we will, of course, bring you the latest here on NewsX World.
Thank you very much, Thomas Borges, for joining us from New York and giving us all the insights. Now we move on. Typhoon Bualoi continues in the Philippines and Vietnam. According to civil defense officials, at least 24 people have lost their lives in the Philippines. 10 of them were killed in the province of Biliran alone. In Vietnam, 11 people have died and 17 others are still missing. The typhoon has damaged houses and knocked out power grids as the storm brought flooding rains and huge swells before losing some of its strength as it headed towards Laos. Meanwhile, Vietnam has closed airports and evacuated thousands of people in vulnerable areas. Reports say the typhoon was generating winds of up to 133 kilometers per hour as of 10 GMT local time. Residents from Vietnam have reacted to the typhoon. Let's listen to what they had said.
Quá khủng khiếp và nói chung là 38 năm trong cuộc đời rồi mới thấy một cái cơn bão nó to và nó giật mạnh như thế. Cả đêm ngủ là không ngủ được, dần tôn là giật đùng cả đêm. Cửa kiếc chỉ là sập, giật cả đêm nên là cảm nhận của mình thì thấy nó quá ghê gớm, quá sức tưởng tượng.
Bão rít rất mạnh, đã qua gần như là mình ở trên tòa bên chung cư thế này thì gần như bắc qua là người dân là thức cả đêm và đa số là người dân toàn là víu cửa. Như cơn bão trước thì người dân gần như không thích vít cửa, chứ bây giờ người dân toàn là vít cửa để mà giữ khỏi nó bung đấy. Gọi là toàn khu dân cư là gần như là thức trắng đêm.
Bão thì chứng kiến được nhiều cơn bão rồi, nhưng mà cơn bão này nếu mà bão với sức gió ấy, thì cơn bão này là sức gió lớn nhất từ trước đến tới nay ấy.
Well, this is all we have time for. We will continue to bring you more news updates from around the world.